Hello, and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host, Weeb Union, and in this one we start out in the southern direction, where the Russians have captured several fortified positions in between Novoukrayinka and Boyavlenka, as the Russians continue offensive operations in the northwestern flank of Volodar. Following the capture of the settlement of Volodar, the Russians have been launched several offensive operations in the northwestern direction, capturing the settlement of Selotaniva, moving on northwards towards Shakhtarsk, Yasna Polyana, Novoukrayinka, and Bohoyavlenka in the northern direction, capturing most of these settlements, leaving only Shakhtarsk contested. And now the Russians moving towards Maximivka and towards Trudova as they continue offensive operations in the northern direction. They've managed to consolidate their gains and capture a lot of the fortified positions here, where they'll likely look to capture Maximivka and flank the remaining fortified positions by attacking from the eastern and western direction. In the northern flank of Kurhove, it is almost as if there is a challenge between the northern and southern flank on who can capture the most territory, because the Russians have made significant advances here in the northern direction as well. Following the capture of Kurhivka, the Russians moved on to Vovchenka here in the southwest of the settlement, moving through and capturing half of the settlement in a single day, where the remaining parts south of the mining area still remains under Ukrainian control. At the same time, the Russians are capturing the fortified positions of the Ukrainians here in the northern direction. The Russians have also moved on to capture the second third of Novosedivka. They've captured the entirety of Kremenna Balka and moved in to gain a foothold in Voznesenka. The Russians also advancing south of Novodimitrivka, north of Voznesenka, in an attempt to gain control over the fields and forest lines in between the two settlements. They'll then continue pushing towards Sunsivka, as the Russians also move along the railways down south towards the Vovcha River line. In the northern flank, including the advances on the final day of October, the Russians have captured 173 square kilometers of territory, while on the southern flank, including the latest developments, the Russians have captured 181 square kilometers, so the southern flank wins. In terms of strategic significance, population of captured settlements, number of captured settlements, the northern flank wins, considering the capture of Selidova, several fortified positions, and important logistical hubs, industrial areas, and so on, that is included in the northern advance. Moving on to the Kupiansk section of the front line and generally the Luhansk-Kharkiv direction, the Russians have moved into and gained a foothold within Peshtro-Tavneve, where their fighting over the settlement has begun. And further north, the Russians have managed to advance west of Selmahivka as they continue closing the pocket that is forming south of Peshane. The Ukrainians have withdrawn out of it, leaving the entire area in the gray zone, and therefore the Russians have now secured the one paved road in between Berestove and Kruhlyakivka, allowing for further advances through this fall season with the improved supply situation. Further north, the Russians have advanced further within Petropavlivka, capturing the western outskirts of it and the entire forest area here west of Sinkivka. This is the Russians consolidating their gains as they continue fighting through Petropavlivka, capturing some fortified positions and a secondary road into the settlement. The Russians are heavily attacking the northern flank of the Kupiansk direction, reaching the settlement itself by fighting through the forest area and the settlement of Petropavlivka right on the outskirts of Kupiansk, while at the same time they're securing the supply route to Kruhlyakivka and Sinkove, and at the same time they're moving down south towards Peshtro-Tavneve to fight in the direction of Borova. So we see that there are two separate assaults towards the eastern bank of the Uska River line, which is towards Borova, that is moving through Kruhlyakivka in the north, and Peshtro-Tavneve in the east, while at the same time there's the offensive towards Kupiansk going through from the Petropavlivka direction as well as from the Stepova-Novoselivka direction in the east. So we see a northern and eastern assault from both the Kupiansk direction and Borova direction following the Russian capture of Sinkove. Capturing Borova would be the third out of four crossings over the Uska River line, where the final one is near the Uskil settlement at the bottom of the Uska River line, which is a normal area. There's just a very small river line, Of course, there are some bridges blown, as there is everywhere, but this is one of the main crossings and the final crossing along the Uskil River line. If the Russians capture Borova, then there will be the only crossing that is with a bridge across the Uskil River line, and the Russians would have separated the rest of them. In the Kursk direction, there is no changes. However, there is this shield-gated footage confirming Russian presence within Novoivanovka following the Ukrainian counterattacks to attempt to regain control over the settlement. The Russians have been holding on and have been able to hold these gains. In terms of North Korean soldiers being sent to the Kursk region to fight the Ukrainians, is it true or not? It's hard to say, but based on the fact that they are so adamant about pulling this out and talking about it, it is likely that it could be true. And why would North Korea have an interest in sending soldiers to Russia to fight the Ukrainians? Well, simply combat experience. That is something that you cannot gain without fighting, and that is something North Koreans have an interest in, considering the possibility of war with South Korea, since there's no peace deal between the two countries. At the same time, Russia and North Korea went into a strategic partnership deal, which was ratified just last week, which says if one country is invaded by another country, then they will defend each other, similar to the NATO Article 5. And therefore, because it was ratified and the Ukrainian incursion into Kursk can be considered a Ukrainian invasion of Russia, which it is, then North Korea is bound by that treaty to defend Russia in the Kursk region. Why would Russia be interested in having North Korean soldiers fight in the Kursk region? Well, extra troops is always nice to have. If the North Koreans would be happy to gain combat experience, why not let them fight instead of the Russians on their own territory? Moving down south again to the advances Russians have made. With the capture of these fortified positions, there is only 2 remaining here in the western parts, which the Russians can bypass through the main road north of Novoukrayinka. At the same time, the Russians can control the road north of these fortified positions from Yasna Polyana. Combining these 2 sides, the Russians would be able to flank the Ukrainian positions, cut them off from supplies, and encircle them. At the same time, it allowed the Russians to then fight in the direction of Maximivka to gain control over that settlement, which is the final settlement in this direction, ahead of this river line in the northern direction, as well as Rusliv and the western direction. So there's a large gap between the next settlement following Maximivka. It seems here on the final day of October, the Russians just continued offensive operations, and as was expected when the ISW stated that a Russian offensive will run out of steam, I called bullshit on that. Due to the fact that the Russians are fighting at a sustainable rate, they're not launching any massive offensives that they cannot sustain. Instead, it is regularly, slowly increasing the efforts as their army size increase, as their materials increase, and this allows them to slowly speed up the process. And then at some point they switched from this gradual increase to a sudden increase where they stopped sending additional troops to the front line at a sustainable rate. Instead, they kept it at a cap, and then they prepared extra units, which was then rotated in at a specific point, which was during the 20th of October, reportedly. And since then, they launched a new offensive with the newly rotated units, which allowed them to have a sudden increase in the amount of troops they had available, which allowed for these large-scale offensive operations, capturing 180 square kilometers in 11 days' time. In this single section of the front line, in the northern direction, the Russians are continuing the offensive operations here as well, capturing Kreminna-Belka and entering Voznesenka improves Russian positions here significantly. They're looking to advance along the railways all the way to Bereztsky. This will cut off the remaining parts of the pocket here in the southern direction. The Ukrainians are already in full retreat, withdrawing from settlement after settlement. Get out of this pocket before it's fully formed. And the Ukrainians are naturally taking casualties on the run as they are under constant Russian surveillance and fire. Aligning the front line with the north of the Vovcha River line will allow the Russians to be in such close proximity to Korokhove that they can take advantage of their positions in the northern bank to shoot the Ukrainian positions within Korokhove with direct fire, artillery, FPV drones, and so on. and they will only have to worry about the western flank, as the Ukrainians will be unable to attack from the northern direction, while the Russians have already entered and gained a foothold in the eastern outskirts of Kurakhove. This will improve the Russian positions there and heavily affect the Ukrainian positions within the industrial area and the apartment complex area in the western parts of Kurakhove, which is the strongest part of the settlements, and capturing those would be the end of Kurakhove. Something else to note is Kurakhove itself is located on the low ground. It is for the most part somewhere around the 120 to 140 meter elevation, while on the northern bank we can enter into 150, 160, 170, close to the riverbank. The closer the Russians are to the riverbank with these 20-30 meter elevations, the easier it is for the Russians to set a tank at the riverbank and simply shoot directly into Kurakhove on Ukrainian positions. The Russians would be able to turn Kurakhove into a fire pocket where they have a firing squad along the northern bank of the river line and simply directly shoot into Kurakhove from the northern direction. This means it will be difficult for the Ukrainians to hold on to Kurakhove for much once the Russians capture the northern bank of the Vovcha river line, which will be the first objective of the Russians in the November month, as the Russians continue offensive operations in the south to capture Maximivka and move towards the southern direction of Kurakhove, potentially even in the direction of Rusliv and Konstantinopel. At the same time, the Russians can launch operations along the western parts of Kurakhove, bypassing the settlement and moving towards Andreevka, fighting off the settlement completely, and forcing a Ukrainian withdrawal from the pocket, which would be a massive one, surrounding thousands of Ukrainian soldiers, including elite units and so on, air assault brigades, mechanized brigades, and specialized brigades operating in this pocket. It would be upwards of 10,000 soldiers of the Ukrainian army, which is already short on manpower, which would be a very significant loss for the Ukrainians. So such an operation would be very difficult for the Ukrainians to deal with. Therefore, it is likely that the Ukrainians would rather withdraw their forces than be caught in an encirclement, because the consequences would simply be too dire. If the Ukrainians do not send additional forces here to the Pokrovsk direction or the Kurakhove direction, then the Ukrainians would not be able to stabilize the situation. They'll eventually end up in this scenario where they'll be encircled and forced to withdraw from a significant portion of the front line. So generally, the Ukrainian incursion needs to end, otherwise they will lose Kurakhove and potentially Velikonovosilka and Pokrovsk by the end of the year. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.